Hello, everyone. Welcome to the M&A Healthcare Insights podcast, where we discuss transactional truths for those who care. Today, I'm very excited by our guest. He and I have had many conversations about the state of healthcare M&A, and today I think will be very informative for you as it relates to not only the transactional process, but the climate of healthcare M&A nationwide. Today I'm joined by Ken Yood, a partner at Holland Knight, a nationwide law firm. And Ken has a specific focus on healthcare. He has been a healthcare attorney for many years now. And with that intro, Ken, really would like you to expand on what I talked about and you know how you have been part of healthcare M&A for many years.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, you said for many years. That kind of seems like an understatement when I started in 1990. So we're talking over 30 years. But I think one of the benefits of being in it for so long is that I've seen a lot of changes and had a lot of different experiences with a lot of different clients who are both buying and selling healthcare companies, whether it's providers, home health agencies, large healthcare systems, hospitals, pharmacies, or suppliers, durable medical equipment suppliers, all sorts of different configurations, different services, and nonprofit and for-profit. In fact, when I started out, we were doing lots of nonprofit, religiously affiliated healthcare system work. That has sort of gone by, I wouldn't say the wayside, but it's certainly been diminished in its importance by the overwhelming number of for-profit parties in the healthcare system. Private equity, strategic investors have sort of shaped the landscape lately. And in fact, as we go along, I've got some news in California about some recent developments that I think are very important for this state and sort of speak to what's going on in the rest of the country too, relating to private equity investment, the marketplace, who's buying, who's selling, things like that.
I like that. I like the teaser. You know how this works. Keep them listening till the end. Well, I think, Ken, one of the things I've enjoyed most about our conversations has been your sort of, obviously, your level of information and knowledge around so much of what happens in these deals, not only from the legal perspective, but also from the commercial perspective and what the market standards are. But you also keep it interesting. And I think that that's part of it, too, is, these deals can take a life of their own and they can, move along, they can, drag along. And it's nice to know that you have somebody on their side who's innovative, who keeps it interesting. And frankly, like, I love this work. I think it's a lot of fun. And it's nice when other people find it to be amusing as well, and entertaining as well. So, so I think you've definitely got that spirit. Let's dig in. Today, as you said, we're going to be talking about sort of the nationwide state of healthcare M&A and the different players involved, sort of what's happening from a regulatory standpoint. Clearly, like how that plays into these lower middle market transactions. You've done a lot of mid-market transactions. We're focused on the smaller to medium-sized business community, so lower middle market. And so as we take sort of that nationwide focus, we want to distill it down today to talk about really what is the ways that we contribute to getting a deal closed, right? And how do we protect our clients? And where are the pitfalls along the way that we try to circumvent on a day-to-day basis in our representation? So this podcast is really dedicated to drafting documentation for success, but it's also drafting a game plan. So we're drafting, we're guiding for success, and we're protecting our clients against failure. And I think those are two of the sort of the components. And we want to talk about how do we do that, right? Like, these deals are not just set it and forget it, right? Every day there's something new. We get into these situations where we have to innovate we have to, work through these problems, problem solves. I always put, attorneys into two categories, right? Like kind of troublemakers and troubleshooters. And I say that with an immense amount of reverence.
Hmm.
But I think that I always try to work with troubleshooters in that regard, because these deals, no two deals are the same, right? So how do we work on that? And I think from that standpoint, discuss your role as an attorney in terms of LOIs, definitive agreements. Like, when do you like to come into a process, and what do you like to start working on as you start to guide clients through a successful transaction?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. To me, to my mind, my job is to close a deal. It's not my job to close the wrong deal. It's my job to close the right deal. And also, I'm very mindful of the fact that I need to be the lawyer that my client needs, that the deal needs. And it's different depending upon the complexion of the deal. Oftentimes, if the deal is the creation of a joint venture, if the deal includes the ongoing participation of the seller in the sold enterprise, the deal shouldn't be a slash and burn exercise where you try to you know get the best of everybody without any care or consideration of what kinds of relationships or what kind of tone that you're forming. I need the deal to be the prelude to ongoing success, especially when the sellers are going to be participating on the sold enterprise, or when the compensation is in some significant part based upon post closing performance. You want to make sure that everything's working. So being the client that the deal and the attorney needs is really important. As far as when I want to participate, gosh, I'd love to participate from the very beginning. And I know that may sound self serving, but I want to make sure, and this is sort of a tip for how do you increase the odds that you're actually closing. As a seller, I want to know what I'm selling.
Hmm.
I don't want my buyer to be surprised that that when I've represented myself as owning a Lexus, I've actually have a Dodge Dart. Dodge Darts, it shows my age. Those don't really exist anymore. I could say a Gremlin; those don't exist anymore. But
Although I
but
think both those cars have come back now, Ken. So
oh,
they,
okay,
they could be,
all
they could be seeing a
right, all right.
resurgence.
Mhm. So I want to make sure I know what I have, because I want to make sure, especially if I've got multiple bidders for my business, I want to be able to evaluate a bid based upon an understanding of what might be discovered as part of a due diligence process by the buyer, in the next few weeks and months. And so, to the extent that I can be there at the very beginning to sort of frame, what's presented to potential buyers, describing the business, that's great. Oftentimes, I recommend to sellers that, hey, we got to do sell side due diligence internally, because
Hmm.
I need to know, you need to know what the buyer's going to see from its perspective. And in that regard, working with an attorney that's been both on the buy side and the sell side is really helpful. I mean, I can bring uh, the perspective of what it means to basically, do the excavating into a business to understand how it works. Sell side due diligence often gives you an opportunity to look at what you've got. And if we're talking about sort of what's the most likely reason a deal doesn't close, it's because that sell side due diligence wasn't done and there's a problem. I
Yeah.
mean, the worst thing you want to do is to get a bid for $50 million and watch it get reduced to 20, or get a bid for, 1.5 and watch it become, you know, a million, because there's some regulatory regulatory issue that needs to be resolved. I hate putting money in escrow for a contingency that I know will never happen, but it doesn't look good on paper.
Right.
That
Right.
shouldn't be there. There may be things you want to do before putting yourself on the market to relieve yourself of a contingency that really shouldn't be there, whether it's, and this is in the healthcare perspective, a regulatory issue where you haven't gotten the appropriate approvals on the deal you did last time, or there's been some kind of survey and corrective action plan, you've put it in place that hasn't been completed. You want to present as clean and accurate a picture as possible to get from day one to day to the closing party.
Yeah. No, look, I think everything you're talking about in terms of coming in early
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of sense. And then what we talk about with our clients, and there's been analysis on this in terms of the broader M&A landscape,
Mm-hmm.
but we say to our clients, look, you know, we're building a team, right? And there has to be trust within this team.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're literally a team, we're cohesive, and we need an attorney in that regard. It's going to give us another perspective, right? And it's going to give us a way of looking at whatever we get from the buyer, whether it's an IOI or a more involved LOI. Like we want to have that perspective, and then we like to have you involved prior to that. I mean, if you're retained, when we're retained, we can talk about the importance of sell side due diligence because we talk about trust a lot. We talk about trust within the team and then trust with the
Mm-hmm.
buyer, given that these deals are not collateralized. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's no earnest money here, right? The what we
Mm-hmm.
trade in is how does the buyer operate? How does it look like? With based on their experience, based on the vetting that we do, does it look like there's somebody that's going to live up
Mm-hmm.
to what they have stated they would live up to in their contract or in their LOI.
Mm-hmm.
And then from our perspective, we want to make sure that we're prepared too. So that's what we talk about. We talk about trust. We talk about preparedness. And if you don't go in with those, I think with those two components, the deal is destined to fail. So I think it's funny that you're right. I mean, there is a lot of hesitancy to take on these expenses, whether it's attorney retainer, whether it's our retainer, whether it's the sell side quality of earnings study. But all of those, investments on the front end will pay massive dividends on the back end
Right.
of the deal. And,
Right.
and so, yeah, I mean, you can see it in terms of mid-market transaction. I think you have a lot more likelihood of sellers going into it with a committee and saying, look, this is how it has to be done. There's somebody usually on that board that's been through a
Mm-hmm.
transaction before and says, this is how it happens. The challenge with the lower middle market is, these are folks who are, very entrepreneurial, roll up their sleeves, they put their shoulder to the wheel. They kind of feel like, hey, we can do this on a shoestring. We can do this with a lean and mean team.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. But at the same time, don't keep from doing something that's going to be a real good investment for the transactional
Oh,
future of your
absolutely.
business.
Absolutely. And I know from, my experience, and I think this comes with being a healthcare lawyer for so long and being in a industry that substantially is middle market. You
Right.
know, a lot of, a healthcare companies are, significant regional players, significant local players, but they're not Boeing. I mean, there's some huge healthcare conglomerates that have a substantial size where you might see that kind of size. The largest deal I ever did was $4 billion, which is crazy, but you wind up doing much smaller deals, which are between 1 and 2 million. I mean, it's just sort of the way healthcare shakes out. As far as cost, remember, and I'm sure we're talking about it, there's different steps in a transaction. From a client perspective, I would want an attorney that has experience in each of those steps and understands and helps you budget, the costs that you're going to experience uh, in each of those steps. And maybe, you know, talk to your lawyer about, pricing different steps in different ways. There's a whole host of things that you can do. And certainly the variety of things you can do becomes greater the more informed your client, your attorney is on what it takes to close a deal, whether you're doing sell side due diligence and what you know the cost of that might be given the size of the organization. It's different than negotiation.
Right.
So there's different ways to think about it that can help you make a smart choice. Um, Getting somebody up front and early doesn't mean you're increasing your costs with no benefit. The
Yeah. Right.
benefit should always outweigh the costs. And you need an attorney, you need a consultant that realizes what their role is and what their value is, and make sure that you're getting value all along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such a high mutual commitment uh,
Mm-hmm.
with these clients, and we need that reciprocated to us as well in that
Mm-hmm.
regard.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that, look, we can guide you through this, and you have obviously a lot of uh, acute uh, advice and a lot of knowledge in terms of all facets of the legal sort
Mm-hmm.
of pathway that we take in these transactions. But whatever you need to lean on, you also have within the firm, which is why, I mean, being with the firm that you're with, Holland and Knight, there's just resource upon resource where the bench is so deep. You can say, hey, I need someone for regulatory. I need to have some conversations on tax matters, and those are the kind of things where that's also helpful. You may benefit from some economies of scale there in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that, look, Ken will handle it. He's going to go and talk to folks, and we don't have to go out there and find somebody in these other areas, these other disciplines of law. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Ken, let me go a little more specific on sort of areas where you can really add value in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the documentation, or maybe pre-documentation. But
Mm-hmm.
one area is like, I'm thinking the key components that you look for in an LOI. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm starting a little later than you want to start, but is there something before that you want to talk about in terms of the deal flow, or chronology of the deal, or do you feel like it's really when the LOI comes in that you're starting to really provide you can give advice on deals, but I think, do you give your legal advice when the LOI comes in, and then that's where you can really start to add value? So that the key components of
Yeah.
an LOI is one question I have specifically for you.
Um, Talking about when to come in, as we just spoke about before, that's pre LOI. Um, I think the most important thing, as I said, is to know who you are and make sure you present who you are so your buyer doesn't have surprises later on. To the extent that you're providing, just brief information to potential bidders, if it is a bidding situation or you're going out and marketing yourself, knowing what you're marketing, is something that, I can, help with, or an experienced healthcare lawyer or transactional lawyer can help with. How do you describe yourself in a way that makes you the most appetizing? That being said, sometimes the lawyer doesn't get the privilege of being there at that time. I do think that sell side diligence is really important. The extent of that diligence, can be, you know, you know, all sorts of things, and certainly varies depending upon whether or not there's some issue that needs to be resolved at some point along the way. Uh, but that's all pre LOI stuff.
We like three, yeah, and I think there's,
Hmm.
in that regard, there's three categories probably. Like there's a financial
Hmm.
component, Q of E, sell side Q of E. I mean, if we have that document, that's in many ways a seminal document by which we can develop so much around the narrative of the deal, right, and
Hmm.
around the asset. right? So that would be great if we can get that, and really in many cases now we're just sort of requiring that it happens, and we might be able to make adjustments for how we're paid and all that to get that done because we think it's so
Hmm.
important as a
Hmm.
document.
Hmm.
I'd say another area is definitely on the clinical side, right? And really understanding what's going on. I mean, that could involve some billing, but mostly it just involves how the documentation and the charts for these
Hmm.
businesses look.
Hmm.
Understanding, if there's potential clawbacks,
Hmm.
and how we're going to deal with those, or how do we mitigate the risks for the buyers coming in on some of those,
Hmm.
or how can we clean up that
Hmm.
sort of the intake and anything now, so that
Hmm.
when the deal does close, we've got those charts are all on the up and up in terms of the healthcare laws, which are very
Yeah.
difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
And then I'd say
Yeah.
that I think the third is really legal, because legal delves into certain things like benefits programs, and it might delve into you might there might be some overlap with these other two components, but I'd say also when you start talking about the tax matters, right? Like there's components there to that. How do we best structure this transaction? Like financial might say from an accounting standpoint, well, here's you're going to be your tax implication, right? But then legal can come in and go, hey, let's structure this deal to minimize that tax implication, right? And 338H10 elections and things that you can do to structure transactions, and it maybe even looking at the deal as we go into the LOI and talking about gross ups on on the deal in terms of how the taxes are handled for each
Hmm.
party. So I think
Hmm.
those are so we definitely agree on that.
Hmm.
Let's say you do come in a little later than you want than you'd want to, because I'd love for somebody to back me up on all those things, right? Let's say you do come a little later, uh,
Right.
and you get the LOI in front of you. Where do you do then to really keep it moving forward? Like what do you
Right.
do there when you look at it? What can we do now? Like what are some new techniques now with this, given that we're in a different environment deal wise, that are best practices that you can do to add
Yeah.
value in the LOI.
Yeah. Well, it's important to remember the LOI, for the most part, except for some key provisions, are going to be non-binding. So, really, what the LOI does in a large part is set expectations for the deal. That you have a broad outline of what you think the transaction is going to look like, to the extent that and this sort of goes to the tax issues, for example, to the extent that there is a uh, tax issue that means that a certain form of transaction is just a non-starter for you. You know, having that referenced within the LOI in some broad way is helpful. It sets an expectation. As far as sort of what's binding, um, issues about exclusivity. You're not going to shop yourself around while you're talking to whoever your fiance is, really. Uh, you're not also relating to things like who's going to pay the expenses of the transaction? Is the buyer going to pick up your legal costs, for example, or something else? That's something that could be in an LOI. Indemnification, to the extent that you're going to have, you're able to convince your buyer to sort of protect you from issues regarding ongoing liability if somehow your representations and warranties are sort of off kilter. You might want to have something like that that would be binding into the deal, because you're going to be going out and looking for insurance if that's what happens. Um, so those are the kinds of binding stuff. Confidentiality, you're going to want to negotiate that. Kind of boring in the sense that your confidentiality provisions are going to be much like anybody else's. But certainly you want to make sure they're right. And on the exclusivity side, if the deal's not going to work, you want out of that really quickly.
Yeah.
So having setting the time frames for the different stages of a deal, would be in the LOI. If you need to close by the end of the year, which a lot of people do for a lot of different reasons, bake it in, right? Set the expectations. That's what the LOI is really about. Um, yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
sort of the way
I,
it
I
goes.
would say that when it comes to exclusivity,
Hmm.
we have gotten a lot more specific about milestones in recent LOIs.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, there's been a slew of breakups after we had that record year, in 2022. And
Hmm.
then I'd say, sometime in the last 18 months, it's just been difficult, right? I mean, and there's a variety of reasons, and we've talked
Hmm.
about this on previous broadcasts, just about how
Hmm.
there's just challenges around cost of capital, and there's
Hmm.
and there's challenges around underwriting, and the types of buyers and the scrutiny that they're under, for their return on investment and all that stuff. So there's all these
Hmm.
challenges facing it that cause these breakups. What we want to make sure is that we get into a deal and we get that deal done with that
Hmm.
buyer. And you're right, if it's not going the direction we expected it to, we want out. And so one of the things we're doing is saying, okay, you have to do your buy side Q of E within a certain amount of time.
Hmm.
And if you don't do it, we may still stay on the deal, but exclusivity terminates. Another one is you have to deliver us a purchase agreement by a certain
Hmm.
amount of time, the definitive by a certain amount of time. And if you don't do it, we might still go, but but no more exclusivity. And
Hmm.
then you have your sort of standard exclusivity, 90 days or
Hmm.
so, right at that
Hmm.
point. So, you kind of hit these 1 month, 2 month, 3 month thresholds where, hey, everyone's on the same page. And if we're all working well and moving forward, then we'll know. And I think those are three milestones for us because those really do represent the buyer putting an investment and committing to analysis on this transaction. And that's what we want to see from the buyer because we don't see other hard components like we don't see money in some way. And it's rare that we get a breakup fee, and they don't get it either, right? They don't get it in their direction either, but they want it, but they don't get it. And so you have to sort of, I think, stick to the chronology. So that's a big part for us. I mean, how
Yeah.
do you agree with those milestones, or are there other things you can
Well,
do for exclusivity?
yeah, absolutely. And also I think something that's worth saying, you think about the different stages of a deal and you think about when and where the seller has the most leverage.
Mm-hmm.
The LOI is the place where you have the most leverage because you're framing the conversation, you're framing the expectations. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest motivators to get a buyer to move in a reasonable fashion to get things done is your exclusivity provisions.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
tell your buyer, listen, if you don't wrap up your diligence in 30 days, I'm going back into the market. We'll still work together, but I'm going to start shopping around. What a motivator, right?
Right.
And you can wind up in situations where that's the thing that sort of brings you to closure on the diligence side. Another way to bring closure on the diligence side obviously relates to the work that you do before you get to the LOI stage. We talked about sell side due diligence. I feel like a mockingbird saying the same thing over and over
Well, no,
again.
gosh, I respect it because you're right. I mean, it's so important. Preparing is so important, and it's overlooked all the time. And it's a fight. I mean, we're on the sell side representation. We're fighting to do these, to cover this analysis that is so important, vital, vital to making sure that we get beyond what the counterparty analysis is.
And I'll
You know?
tell you, think about it on two ways. The sell side diligence is not just to find hidden liabilities that you want to clean up, so it doesn't work against you during the negotiation process to get you to closing, but it's also to find value. Sometimes people don't know what they have, right? I mean, and to the extent that you are a smaller entity or that your growth has been organic. I mean, I've seen situations where the accounting systems aren't capturing the full picture because the the complexity of the marketplace has increased substantially faster than the internal control systems of the organization have changed. So part of what you do, part of what I think the consultant does, is to identify where information is missing, and that information can present a better story than you imagined. It
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, I've got two examples, both on
Hmm.
both ends of the spectrum in
Hmm.
that regard. When there was all of the testing sites going on
Hmm.
during COVID,
Hmm.
we had people coming to us, that were making $100 million,
Yeah.
and their cash flow was just ridiculous, right? And they were like, "Oh, we want to sell our company," and I'm like, "Yeah, but there's no future value here.
Yeah. Where are
Like,
the legs?
there's nothing here, right?
Right.
I'm just like take the money, put it in your pocket, and and go have a great life.
Hmm.
Um, there's no thing here transactionally. And I remember like that was one of those cases where I had to tell somebody that had a huge expectation on enterprise value that their company was pretty much worth nothing.
Hmm.
It had a tremendous amount of cash flow value, but that there was a sunset period and it was coming quick at them.
Hmm.
And then the other side of it is when I think about a recent transaction where the seller had immense what we call cap liability, as you know,
Hmm.
on hospice,
Hmm.
and they were paying it off. So their cash flow in recent years was very low because of these payoffs that they had to do.
Right.
But they were still growing their census. Now they were bringing in first, like first intake
Hmm.
patients. They were, there was discharges that were happening more frequently. So they had completely gotten their cap under control. But they had this liability from a cash flow standpoint. They were paying. Once we did the Q of E on the sell side, they saw that, hey, your EBITDA is outstanding right now because we accrued for that
Hmm.
cap liability in the years that you inherited.
Right.
And so that's what this kind of analysis can do on the front end is
Hmm.
that you're right. It might give you information that adds value where you didn't think it existed. Unfortunately, most of our clients think that their business is worth, you know, 20 times more than it's actually worth. And
Hmm.
we love that and we think, hey, that's great. But if you wanna, meet that expectation on value, then we need to do some prep work right now too,
Right.
right?
Right.
We do agree. Your child is the best looking child. Uh, you
Well
know,
above average.
the,
Everybody is well above average.
they're all above average. They're the best athletes. They're the smartest students. All
Hmm.
that. But I think yeah. So now let's talk about something else conceptually.
Hmm.
What we hope for in a transaction is multiple offers,
Right.
right? And how do you recommend uh, best practices in terms of dealing with those multiple offers, right? And usually what we have is, right, we have the bell curve of offers where, there's a bunch of them in there, and then usually we'll have one or two outliers,
Hmm.
right? And they'll be 20-40% more. So we talk about that conceptually a lot with our clients. But what we want to do is sort of go back to those folks, and we want to keep everyone engaged, right? Because the bell curve offers might actually be the real offers, and these might not be the right buyers.
Hmm.
They may not have the experience and all that. And we want to make sure that we land on the buyer that's going to get the deal closed and get
Hmm.
us as close to our highest enterprise value as possible. How do you recommend dealing in a multiple offer situation in terms of documentation or in terms of responses to these buyers?
Well, I'll tell you, this is so important because and it's not just the overall purchase price, which a lot of people get confused. Someone throws, a big number on the table that's not in line with what they're seeing elsewhere, and suddenly that is the shiny object that distracts their attention from the other things. You want, as you just said, to work with someone who is going to bring this thing to closure. So, in that regard, when you're looking at an offer, are they asking for, are the conditions to closing just, incredible? How are they planning on paying that purchase price? How much is how much is being paid at closing, how much is being paid at post closing, what are the expectations for the ongoing value of a business that might affect how much you get paid and when you get paid. And when you get paid is so important because
Right.
it really changes the value of the deal. Um, so that's there, and that's important. Also, you mentioned sort of what you know about the history of your buyer. Have they done this kind of deal before? Have they been in this marketplace? Uh, and To the extent that they have a history of bringing things to closure, uh, knowing that and gives you a sense of comfort that they're giving you a an offer not just to take you off the market for a period of time, not just to sniff around to get a better sense of who's in the marketplace, which is sort of disingenuous, sort of false front kinds of situations, which are horrible, but I've seen them happen. Which goes to what kind of experience these people have had before. Um, but So you want to look at that background to evaluate what they're saying. But I would look toward sort of what their experience has been, what's going to be of interest to them as part of the disclosure process. You can see some of that, whether or not they're willing to pay for indemnity insurance, whether or not they're willing to pick up transaction costs. When I think I said when they're going to be paying the purchase price, how much at closing, how much after. Uh, so that's about that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. You're sort of saying the old adage, like, price, uh, is important, but so is ability to close, right? And
Hmm.
and I think that in that regard, we really have to tip the scales towards capacity for getting this thing done, uh, with from the buyer's perspective, more so than whatever enterprise value they're claiming, because
Hmm.
behind that enterprise value, and even when we're dealing in the lower middle market, uh, these may not be huge transactional values, but even behind that, it's very rare that someone's going to come in and pay for something, all cash. And by the way, there's another thing,
Hmm.
like terminology wise, all cash doesn't mean like literally they have a suitcase and they're, dropping it off, at your, at your office, right? And you're counting the money. Like it's
Right.
literally that a cash transaction means that they have some money behind them that's in the form of debt, most likely,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
There, we try to minimize the amount of seller paper that or a note that the seller takes on. We really try to minimize that. We try to
Hmm.
minimize, other post-transactional components
Hmm.
to the deal, like earnouts, deferred payments of some kind. But
Hmm.
but at the end of the day, like the buyer's going to come in, they're going to have some form of underwriting on that money, right? And it might be a committee, it might be a financial buyer that has a mezzanine component, like they might have some debt that's built into
Hmm.
their fund, debt capital that's built into their fund. But I think what we are trying to let them know is that look, they have to go through some kind of financing scrutiny, some kind of underwriting in this, and that we need to know that they're going to come out the other side of that, and this deal is going to get approved. And sometimes, when you put this high enterprise value and you don't have the EBITDA to support it, right? It's difficult for an underwriter, if it's coming from a commercial lending source, to approve the deal, right? And
Hmm.
then maybe they have other options. Maybe they can go, even if they get an approval letter. How many times have I seen it where we get the approval letter, QB is done, they go back to the underwriter, and the underwriter has new covenants on them that they can't live up to, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that really is part of it, is assessing who can get this deal closed,
Hmm.
um, and then also in a timely manner, like you're talking about. Chronology of these things are so
Hmm.
important. But
Hmm.
give us, because you've got this storied.
I just say
uh,
one
yeah.
thing, the other thing, and I don't know if you've seen this happen too, you know, the type of buyer is really important. Is this a strategic buyer
Yes.
or is
Yes.
it more for a financial investment situation? I mean,
Hmm.
to be perfectly honest, you might get more. a more favorable deal financially from a PE fund or someone who's doing this, for investment purposes than you would for somebody who's doing this for strategic purposes. But to the extent that they're doing it for strategic purposes and the money feels right to you, honestly, I think there's more security in getting to closing with them because they've got a long-term reason to get there.
Yeah, you're right. You're
Your
so right.
PE fund may be just trying to flip it, but it's those are the kinds of things that you need to consider. Who are you dealing with? What's their solvency profile? How are we going to get to closing, and what's the purpose of this deal for them?
You're so right. I mean, we talk about that too with our clients about the
Hmm.
differences and how they review the deal as well. Like, what's their expectation? I mean, for financial firms, it's almost squarely EBITDA, right? Because
Hmm.
they need to get a return on invested capital that is a metric based on that cash flow, EBITDA being a proxy for cash flow.
Hmm.
Whereas the strategic firm, they might just be looking for market share, right? And just increasing it. Like if they can increase, their market share by, a few by this number of patients, or if they can make a little bit more money on the revenue side of it, right? Like that could be important for them, right? And they've got and they may operate in a very sophisticated way because they have an investment arm or a business development component within their
Hmm.
strategic. But you're right,
Hmm.
and look, I want to backtrack a little bit on what I said too. That a strategic company will probably give you a lower offer,
Hmm.
but there's a much more likelihood of closing. And
Hmm.
in their offer might just be from free cash flow from the firm, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so there that might be another way for us to say, gosh, I really much prefer to do this deal. By the way, when they get into due diligence, like they know everything they're looking at, right?
Hmm.
And so they're also sort of we operate this way. We know how to benefit right away from synergies. And as opposed to a private equity that might have a platform, but it's vertical integration, and then it has to have some kind of exit plan down the road. So you're right. That's a great point.
Yeah,
Um,
and that exit plan may be very quick, right? So
yeah,
what they're interested in looking at, even though the financial situation is of paramount importance for a strategic situation, it's a long-term play.
yes,
So they're going to be looking at different things, and I think could be the way you present yourself changes.
that's that's right. And I think that's so we were taking this into account in terms of all these multiple offers and who
Mhm.
how we go back to them and who we want to preserve in a
Mhm.
process and in terms of the likelihood of getting it done. Do you have since you've been in this for so long? I mean, do you have any particular like highlights or something that something that came up? I mean, like something that sort of speaks to the reasons you've seen deals fail, or like what was done that really made sure that the deal went to the next level. I mean, it'd be love to get some anecdotes on you from that standpoint.
No, well, I'll tell you this. So much of it, from my perspective, the reason why a deal fails is because there's some unearthed liability that is found during the negotiation process that just changes the valuation picture for the buyer, changes the desirability of the transaction. So, for example, to the extent that there is a problem, and you mentioned sort of reimbursement issues, to the extent that there is some problem that was found relating to billing, where the question becomes, hey, do we self disclose and avoid the penalties that might come up if, Medicare finds the problem as opposed to we're finding the problem and disclosing it to them? Big issues that need to be resolved, big issues that color whether or not you're dealing with a contingent liability or a known liability, or no liability if you're able to do corrective action before you even go to the market. That's another story. But I have found situations where regulatory problems have been unearthed that just scare a buyer significantly. And
Mhm.
what kind of buyer it is may change how scared they are. If it's a if it's an investment fund, if it's a PE firm If this is just looked at as a uh, endeavor to buy, make some operational changes, create some more efficiencies, and then flip it, the idea that maybe there's going to be a negotiation with the regulators in order to either make it happen or keep this thing open and limit risks, is a different story. The strategic buyer who is operating a similar facility, in the next county or wherever they're doing it, they may be more sophisticated in knowing how to do things and have a better idea of understanding what is a significant liability and what's simply immaterial. So,
Yeah.
as far as blowing up a deal, it's when the seller doesn't know who they are and they
Yeah.
find out during the course of the negotiation and the diligence process. That will blow up a deal.
Yeah.
To the extent that situations where, I've seen situations where there's been sort of financial mishaps unrelated to the deal on the buyer side, where the security of the purchase price comes into question because you just don't know whether or not they have the financial wherewithal to continue the deal. And you get spooked. They may try to convince you that everything's fine, but you know in your heart of hearts that maybe it isn't.
Yeah.
So, given that exclusivity provision, sometimes you just want to stop,
Yeah.
in order to give yourself an opportunity to deal with somebody who is more more appetizing as a potential buyer. There's also changes, something like that, depending upon what the deal's about, to the extent there's going to be an ongoing relationship between the seller and the buyer because it's some kind of there's a joint venture component to it, or there's an ongoing relationship. The lawyer can poison the water so much that at some point at the end of the day, the seller is saying, I can't stand these people. I mean, it has to be a real, horrible situation, but I am not going to work with these people when there is some kind of post closing escrow that I'm going to need, achieve certain results that will only happen if I have the buyer's cooperation and appetite and understanding for making the strategic moves necessary to achieve those results. If you don't have that, you know,
Yeah.
find
Yeah, I mean,
somebody.
it's sort of it's another layer of that trust, and then it goes
Hmm.
into. I always kind of feel like the
Hmm.
mutual respect,
Hmm.
likability helps. That they've got the right mission.
Hmm.
That their business model makes sense, especially if you have some post transactional monies that you're going to earn.
Hmm.
And I think that's right. What you started off with was just disclosure, right? Like disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. And we spend so much time. I mean, you spend a lot of time. There's a lot of investment in getting the disclosure
Hmm.
schedules
Hmm.
put together. By the way, that's somewhere where we try to help too. Is say, hey, look, we've got this populated data room. We've done all this analysis. Hey, how can we help? If you give us a disclosure skeleton, or like a sort of a template, right?
Hmm.
Can we fill that in for you to try to, help to
Hmm.
facilitate and
Hmm.
expedite the timing around things?
Hmm.
But you're right. We got to show them. That's the thing too. Is like I say this from the beginning. We've got to show them everything, because it's in the hiding of something. First of all, if we hide it, on purpose, that's a huge issue, right?
Hmm.
Like we can't do that. And every business has issues. You can't hide anything. So you got to show everything. And if something comes up during process, or if there's something that was hidden and unknown out there, we better, when we present it, have a rationale for why it wasn't presented and what we're
Hmm.
going to do to correct it.
Hmm.
And I think, yeah,
I
that's
was going to say, and there's some things you should know that may be out of everybody's control. I mean, I've had situations, particularly in hospice, for example. In California, I think this happened in uh, 22, 21, I don't know, something like that, where the state said, we don't like the idea of people setting up hospices, getting licenses, and just using them as a get rich quick scheme because they're going to flip it to somebody else. So there's that 5-year rule, right? I've had situations where negotiations were underway between a hospice seller and a buyer where the hospice was set up only 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So the deal became problematic. And
Right.
so you just have to have advisors, lawyers, consultants, what have you, that understand to keep their eye on that ball, to know when the marketplace might change mid deal in a way that makes either the deal impossible or significantly less appetizing.
Yeah.
Knowing what's coming down the pipe, knowing whether or not reimbursement mechanisms are going to change for whatever kind of uh, provider or entity you're dealing with. You just got to know. You
Yeah, no,
just
that's
got
a great point. I mean, that's a great point for us to conclude on is just how do you know? And I mean, so many things have happened just in this year alone. I mean, if you think about the 80/20 rule with
to.
regards to Medicaid
Mm-hmm.
and and the profitability around those services. And okay, so what does this mean? And is it material or is it just a sort of a political move, right? Like is it
Mm-hmm.
something that we is it performative or is this actually going to practically hurt our business? And then you
Mm-hmm.
think about, yeah, like the moratorium in California on hospices and licenses. And, hey, is there a sunset period on that? What's going on there?
Yeah.
And that's where, we, there's so many nuances. There's so many with the healthcare laws. I mean, then you start talking about HIPAA compliance, and you can go down a rabbit hole here. But it's important
Yeah.
for us to know these things. Like you have to constantly be reminded, like, hey, look, if we're going to show them clinical information and details around these
Mm-hmm.
patients, we need to have a BAA in place.
Mm-hmm.
And just like little things along the way where, oh wow, we didn't do that. There's exposure there, right, for us. And that's really where you come in and say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And then when you get into the definitive agreements, you start talking about reps and warranties and indemnities, and you start thinking about, okay, have you thought about these things? And we've talked
Mm-hmm.
about these things in the past for a while. That they're conceptually difficult to get sellers' heads around.
Yeah.
Once they get into the definitive, though, that's where you come in, and we collaborate together on, the indemnity, the sort of the baskets that exist, and how these reps are broken up.
And one thing that I wish I said before, you were talking about things that you need to focus on in an LOI, things that might blow up a deal. Third party consents. I've had many deals. Well, I shouldn't say many. I've had multiple deals where the reason why the deal didn't close is because they couldn't get landlord consent, or they
Yes.
couldn't get consent from their payer contracts, or the payers wanted to renegotiate the reimbursement levels, or the capitation fee, as a condition to an assignment, if that's necessary. Obviously, that significantly impacts go forward profitability for the buyer. So if, and I'm just making things up, if Blue Shield says, I got to renegotiate this contract and you're going to get, the market has changed. So your per visit reimbursement is going down 30%. Hey, that's a problem. And
Yeah.
those kinds of problems, landlord consent, I'll tell you, it happened just 2 months ago, and it was
Yeah.
so frustrating. These people are just so kind of crazy. And actually, it was a residential treatment facility in Malibu, the home of residential treatment facilities, and it all dissolved because of the landlord.
Yeah. It's such a
So,
passive for a lot of these landlords. They've had these generational properties, and it's such a passive form of income to
hmm
them, and they don't
hmm
understand the concept of, you
hmm
can't unreasonably withhold this
hmm
consent.
right.
We need to assign this thing, and then you're holding up this huge deal. because
Right.
because you can't get a hold of the person, right? Or,
Right,
you
and
know,
that's why
like,
your sell side due diligence needs to focus on what contracts are material and what are the assignment provisions and how can you
yeah,
get out ahead
it's
of those kinds of consents so they don't become an impediment later on.
it's so true. I mean, in closing here, Ken, I think what you're saying, like, so that we have a very simple conceptual focus on what, why we're so important to this is that we're going to anticipate very early on what the obstacles are going to be in this transaction.
Hmm.
Based on the healthcare segment that you're selling, based on what's happening, from a regulatory, from a systemic standpoint, we're going to say, hey, we should do this type of work to prepare for this because this might happen down the road. Yeah. I mean, why not have a conversation with your landlord sooner rather than later, right? Why not understand, like, let's go through the contracts and let's see, hey, when do these contracts terminate? Are they,
Hmm.
automatic renewals? Let's just look at that, right? Let's do an assessment of all that. It's such a great piece of advice because if we've sort of failed in some ways if we're negotiating things when we get to definitive agreements, or if
Hmm.
there's surprises at definitive agreement. It's
Hmm.
it's only going to hurt the deal. It might capsize the deal, and it's
Hmm.
definitely something that you want to get us in early and get us working on right away. And again, as I said, the sooner the better, and and then we can really create value along the way, especially on the back end.
Yeah.
Ken, let me just I'm going to do a shameless plug here in terms of a lot of the concepts. There might have been terminology today that the listeners may have heard that they're not as familiar with.
Hmm.
I know that your firm does a good job of with information and thought leadership. We do as well, and so I would really suggest that anyone that has questions around what we're talking about, we're going to give a we'll do a transcript, but it'll be more of like an FAQ kind of transcript on
Hmm.
this conversation. You can find that at our on our website, which is M&A Healthcare Advisors with an O at the end.com.
Hmm.
And Ken, I know that you have some great resources as well with your firm that people can also cite.
Yeah, and as part of that, the FAQs, which we've been working on already, to put up quickly. There will be references to specific concepts, specifically, in the healthcare context, sort of what's happening in the marketplace, where we've written uh, client alerts, where we've written blog articles. There will be links. Focus on the links. There'll be contact names associated with all of those different things. And certainly, my contact information will be there. Andre's contact information will be there. Call us, kick the tires. Whoever you select as your consultant or your lawyer, find out who they are. As much as you want to know who your buyer is, you want to know who your consultant is and what kind of experience they have, because you want to know somebody who's gone through the process before and also somebody who has the range of expertise that you're going to need. Real estate, tax, all sorts of things. So be thoughtful. The sooner you can be thoughtful, the faster you can be on a beach in Brazil. So just think about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ken. What's the best way for people to find out about your firm and about you?
Well, they'll be, we'll attach it to the materials. We have a website, HK Law, Holland and Knight, law.com, pretty simple. My email address, to the extent you want that, and that will be in the material too, is simply ken.yood, my name, and that'll be there at hklaw.com. So always ask questions, whether it leads to an engagement or not. Ask me questions. If we're
Yeah,
not right, I'll send you somebody else. But I'll tell you this: when you work with a firm that has a significant amount of expertise and a significant amount of experience, we can be right
yeah. Well,
often.
Ken, I really appreciate it, and you're right. You sometimes you ask questions and you don't get the answers, and that's never been the case with you.
Mhm.
Really appreciate your responsiveness and all
My
the insights that
pleasure.
you delivered today. And, look forward to doing another deal together.
Absolutely. Same here.